Halloween retreat this year, or it's the only one we've ever had. It's Mystery and Spirituality, a virtual Halloween retreat. And I'm handing it over now to Liz, who's going to talk to us about the mystery of Halloween.
Okay, so you might have noticed I'm in a lost civilization right now. Underwater, can't give you the GPS coordinates because, what do you call that? A non-disclosure, my bad. So anyway, here we are. There used to be some buildings or something that people presumably came and went from and were part of their daily lives and are now at the bottom of the ocean. What does that have to do with Halloween? We're going to find out in a PowerPoint. So maybe without further ado, Roz, am I able to share the PowerPoint?
Yep, you are able to share.
All right. I have to interact with my underwater drone here.
In an ancient civilization? Okay.
Yeah. Well, they have these underwater drones. Actually, this guy who made it gave it a PlayStation controller. So I'm not sure that's very auspicious.
Are you talking about the Titan?
I'm just saying this underwater drone is a little wacky, so
Okay.
give it a minute. Okay. So this is the deep origins of Halloween. And what this is in a little while, we're going to watch a movie exploring this hypothesis by a guy named Randall Carlson. And it's going to play into the lunch hour. So if you're here during the lunch hour, you want to keep watching or you want to watch it on a link to yourself, you can. But the reason why I have to explain some things about this movie is because the first time I watched it, I was so confused. So without trying to take anything away from Randall Carlson, because he does excellent work, and it's really cool. If you haven't heard any of these terms before, I have to explain to you what they are so that when you see them, you won't be completely like, what is all that? So this is a lovely picture that I painted. And there are a few interesting things in it. Let's see. Next slide. Why do you think you celebrate Halloween? If you ask people this, you get a bunch of answers that are like, for fun, candy, trick-or-treating, parties, children's events, or dressing in costumes. Some people are fans of horror movies, and they will tell you, I celebrate Halloween because I enjoy horror movies and fright attractions. Some people will tell you, oh, it's a pagan harvest festival. And some people will say it has to do with the arrival of fall and the change in seasons. Other people who know a little more about religion, or maybe they grew up in a religion, will tell you it's connected to a Catholic holiday. And they might mention All Hallows Eve, All Saints Day, or All Souls Day. When I talked to my dad, he was raised Catholic and he sees it as All Saints Day. And then there's another category of people, when you ask, they will tell you, I don't celebrate Halloween because it's satanic. Well, is it satanic? We're going to find out. But I think the thing to take away from it is that we don't really associate Halloween with like a deep tradition or a moral lesson. We don't take it seriously. I loved it growing up because it was the one holiday you could go wild, eat a lot of candy, dress up crazy, and have a good time. Other holidays, you had to go to church. I didn't have to go to church for Halloween. We just had trick-or-treating. So here's what you probably thought you were signing up for when you went to an event to talk about the origins of Halloween. And that is the Druids. And I'm going to not try to talk about them so much. Because look at Roz. Roz, you're a Druid today. Is that true?
Yes, I'm being a Druid priestess today.
You have lovely flowers in your hair.
Thank you, Liz.
So the Druids celebrated Halloween with bonfires. They did this to welcome the spirits of their departed family and ancestors who were wandering around at this time of year They were seeking warmth and shelter in a time when the veil between worlds was thin. They would use signs and symbols to ward off evil and also protect people who they love. They had the jack-o'-lantern, which you guys probably remember. It's a very funny tale. The origin of the jack-o'-lantern story is there was a guy who lived a very dissolute life. He has different names, but it's like Slimy Jack or Bad Jack or something to that effect. And then one day, the devil shows up, right, to get him. Says, your time is over, you gotta come with me to hell. And Jack tricks the devil into not taking him to hell. Jack says, well, can you give me one last request? Can I go with you to hell, but first you will let me have the last drink because I just want a drink before I have to go be damned for eternity. And so the devil says, okay. And then Jack takes the devil to a bar and they drink. And while this is going on, the devil's like doing little devil tricks, transforming himself into stuff. And Jack says, well, can you transform into a coin to pay for this beer? And the devil does. And Jack puts the coin in his pocket, where he also has a crucifix. Because even though he's kind of a bad guy, everybody had one in their pocket at that time. So then the devil is trapped and he can't turn back until Jack says, I'll make you a deal. If you don't take me to hell today, I'll let you go. And the devil says, wait a minute. And Jack says, no, how about just for a year? You come back in a year and get me. And I'll take the crucifix out and you can go. And so the devil agrees and Jack lets him go. In a year, the same thing happens. I can't remember all the ways that Jack tricks the devil, but he does this another time and another time. And the last time he says, okay, if I trick you this time, you have to let me go for good. You have to say I'm never going to go to hell. And so the devil says, all right, you got me. You're not coming to hell. So then Jack lives a dissolute life the way he likes to, drinking and scamming people, mainly because that's the thing that he does. And then at the end of that, he dies anyway because he's been hurting his liver and he dies as a result of his life choices. And then he goes up to heaven, to the pearly gates, and St. Peter says, you can't come in here. So then he goes down to hell. And the devil says, hey, we had a deal. You can't come in here either. And so the devil gives Jack a lantern, which is a turnip carved out with a camel in the middle of it. And that's how he becomes Jack of the Lantern. And that's the whole story. And then the end of it is that he has to wander the earth forever because no afterlife destination will happen. So if you're carving pumpkins, so how did that come to America? It came with the Irish, who are the descendants of the Druids. They brought this to America mostly during their waves of immigration related to the potato famine. So if you are carving a pumpkin for Halloween this year, that's why. The Irish, when they came to America, found pumpkins were more plentiful and easier to carve than turnips, and that's why we still carve them today. So that's all I really have to share about the Druids. And if you think you're here to hear about the Druids, I didn't want to leave that part off. But there's something else that's a little bit more involved. So we're going to talk about the research of a guy named Randall Carlson today. And he's a geologist. And in the movie, he's going to point out, I don't know if you guys have studied the flood myth or heard people say stuff like cultures all over the world have a flood myth. Is anybody aware of that? Has anyone heard that before? Right
Yep.
here, Ann?
Yep.
Okay, two? Okay, so a lot of cultures have common themes in their mythology and stories. But Another interesting thing we're going to see in Carlson's research is that he found a number of cultures that celebrate Halloween or a Day of the Dead or some holiday relating to death and dying and the ancestors and stuff like that. But the weird thing was, it's all on the same day. It's all October 31st through November 2nd. And what's weird about that is that you realize that some of these cultures, right, we think Halloween is a harvest time, the weather's changing to winter, the plants are dying, so it's not abnormal to us that, like, this time of year we would think of death and dying. But if you're below the equator, the seasons are reversed, right? Roz can tell us. She lives in Australia. Roz, what are they doing in Australia when it's Halloween here in October?
Well, growing up in Australia, there really wasn't a celebration of Halloween. There is now, and they dress up and do it American style. But the indigenous population celebrated some kind of Day of the Dead in October, which would have been spring. It wasn't before.
Okay.
Yeah.
So south of the equator, the seasons are they're reversed. So Australia is having spring when we're having fall. So it's weird that these cultures, like in Peru, same thing. They have a Day of the Dead kind of a holiday. It's strange, right? Like it's spring and you're celebrating dying. Why would this happen? So somebody finally thought to ask, why is that a thing? Here's a list of some other things that cultures remember around the world that are in more than one mythology. So if you see this, we have flood myths, we have sunken cities. Atlantis is one, but if you Google this, there are a whole list of cities and continents like Mu and Lemuria and Hyperborea and places that have a story that's similar to Atlantis, which was like, at some point there was a great city, and in a terrible day and a night, it was destroyed in a flood or it sank beneath the waves or something to that effect. So that's a thing that is in many cultures. The fallen one is a story of somebody who falls. If you think about Lucifer, it is probably the one you're most familiar with, right? Like someone fell from heaven. He was cast out by his fellow gods or, God or whoever. Lucifer did something to annoy God and he had to fall, right? He told Eve to eat the apple, so he was in trouble. So that is a thing. Randall Carlson in the movie is going to tell you about a fallen middle America god that is depicted in all these arts and pictures. There's also Apollo's son who is driving the sun chariot and he can't keep control of it and he falls. So there's a lot of stories with similar visual images. And that's going to be important later on. We know that the ancient cultures paid way more attention to the stars than probably you or I did. We know they were afraid of witches. They were afraid of apparitions and ill omens in the sky. If something appeared in the sky, I mean, the Jesus story starts that way, right? A star appeared in the sky. That was a sign to them that something was going to happen. So they had to pay attention to it. There's also a category of stories that Randall Carlson is going to talk about, and also Graham Hancock, I think, has some conversations about this. You can walk online. About civilizing gods. A civilizing god, for our purposes, is somebody who comes and teaches something. Okay, so it could
Fire.
be agriculture. It could be,
Fire.
yeah, they bring you fire. Prometheus brings fire. They bring a technology usually, or a complicated knowledge. We also have solar saviors. So a solar savior is somebody in the model of Jesus, the sun, the light of the world, the person who saves us from the dark. A solar savior is also an astrological story, right? Jesus has 12 disciples that he travels around with. And if you think about the sun has 12 signs in the sky that are the zodiac signs that the sun travels through. So there's some kind of connection there. Last thing that appears in many ancient cultures are hospitality rituals and traditions. The idea that it's wrong or bad to turn away the stranger who comes to your town or your house. They often used to have feasts and things like that if somebody arrived who was from out of town. And this is an interesting thing. You kind of think, like, why would an ancient people who have scarce resources have that as a rule? That's a strange rule for them to have, but a lot of them have it. Okay. Well, that escalated quickly. So another thing that you're going to see talked about in this movie that we have to talk about is stories about the end of the world. And that is also a near universal thing that is a preoccupation of some of these ancient cultures. In Greece, they had two ways they thought the world would end. There's a poem on here by Robert Frost. It says, some say the world will end in fire, some say in ice. From what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire. But if it had to perish twice, I think I know enough of hate to say that for destruction, ice is also great and would suffice. Okay. So the ancients were more worried about fire and flood than ice specifically, but if you flooded the whole world and then it cooled off, you might get a fair amount of ice as well. The Greeks had a group of people called Stoics, and they believed there was something called ekpyrosis, which is when the world ends in fire. So I think today we would call ekpyrosis a coronal mass ejection, like a solar flare. The Stoics believed it was the summation of the age in fire. There's also a Hindu version, which is so interesting. They had the Samvartika flame, which in Sanskrit is the fire of destruction that comes to destroy the world at the end of a cycle. It's also a weapon. It's the weapon of Indra, and it's a terrible cloud of fire or energy. It reminds a lot of people of like a nuclear blast. So some people put that interpretation on the world ending fire. Cataclysmos is another Greek word. It's when the world ends in a planet-wide flood. Okay, why does this matter for Halloween? Hopefully there's a slide in here that explains it. Okay, so what did cultures believe caused the world to end? One main thing, if you read Plato's account of Atlantis, is falling out of balance with nature and excessive pride. Both of those were attributed to Atlantis. They were called like an advanced civilization, but they were too prideful and they fell out of balance with nature, and the gods were angry. And in a day and a night of terrible cataclysm, they sank beneath the waves. Other times you'll have misdeeds by gods, demigods, or humans, like crashing the sun chariot. It looks like I've omitted the other end of my end friends there. I probably had a longer list, but somehow got interrupted in the middle of making this slide, so I apologize for that. But this idea of pride and angry gods and someone doing a misdeed that causes the end of the world is sort of interesting, because if you think of a coronal mass ejection or like a climate change leading to a flood, we almost have a similar narrative going on with climate change. Like, hey, we're out of balance with nature. We need to do something about it. We are going to change our climate, and Florida and California are going to be underwater. So we are sort of in the middle of maybe making a similar story for ourselves. This is really important. How many worlds have existed? How many civilizations have there been that ended? And
5.
Some cultures think this isn't the first world. Some of the Maya beliefs is that this is the sixth world. So we've had five cycles ending in different things, sometimes fire, sometimes flood. The Hopi say this is the fourth world. We've had 3 worlds before that didn't work out. If you read Swedenborg, he'll tell you that there have been 4 churches that came and went. And he foresaw a new church, a 5th church, and he thought that would be the last one. According to geologists, these are the ages of the Earth. We are currently in the beginning of the Holocene. Some people want to call the Holocene the Anthropocene because it's the layer in geology that is going to have all our plastic, all our pollution deposits, right? Geologists count time by layers of stuff they find. Archean time is at the bottom, but that's actually not the oldest time layer. There's something that came before Archean time that's called Hadean time, but it's not on here because there's not a layer for it, because that is when the Earth is forming out of an accretion disk, which is like junk coming together in space to form a ball. I asked my dad, because he's a geologist, why does there exist a Mississippian and a Pennsylvanian age on here in the Paleozoic? And he told me it's because that is when coal that is typical of those regions formed. So Mississippi has a very bituminous coal, and Pennsylvania, it's like a very hard anthracite coal. Pennsylvania's coal is apparently more fun for mining because it's not as dirty and dusty as Mississippi coal. But that's why we have 2 states in this Paleozoic age. You probably remember the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous from studying dinosaurs in school. When we get down here, it's like 25 billion years. That is quite a long time ago compared to, just this tiny amount of time that humans have been around making geological layers. Okay, another thing you're going to hear Randall Carlson talk about a lot is a time called the Younger Dryas. The Younger Dryas is a time of rapid climate change at the end of the Pleistocene and the beginning of the Holocene. So you just saw that back there. It's those top 2 things, the most recent 2 layers are eons of time. The Younger Dryas happened between 11,200 and 11,500 years ago. It was a time of mass extinction of animal life. Glaciers melted. There's something called meltwater pulse 1b, which is something that even mainstream geologists believe happened or can see evidence of. It was a time of rapid glacial melt and global flooding. It's preserved in layers of rock. A funny thing you might not know, this will probably only appeal to the Swedenborgians, but I wondered if Swedenborg had ever thought about these issues of lost civilizations and what happened in this deep time that we don't know about and what that mystery was about. So I Googled Swedenborg and Atlantis. I found out he did write about it, but not after his spiritual awakening. Before his spiritual awakening, when he was writing lots of science kinds of stuff, he wrote a pamphlet called The Height of Water, which included the theory that he believed Atlantis might have been Sweden, only when the water level was higher and only the mountains were visible above it as islands. He wrote the pamphlet to agree with one of his countrymen, who also proposed a similar theory that the height of water had been much higher in Sweden in earlier ages. He was convinced of this argument because he observed while climbing around in the mountains of Sweden that there were layers of sea lice stuck in the sides of mountains. So what you see down here on a mountain, how did that happen? And that led him to believe that during the biblical flood, Sweden was fully submerged with just mountains poking out. Geologists don't agree with Swedenborg. Swedenborg was probably not correct on this one. Geologists believe that mountains form through a process of orogeny, which is not as fun as it sounds, right? I'm a little immature. That sounds like erogeny or something to me, but it's not the same thing. That's people bumping into each other. Orogeny is tectonic plates bumping into each other. And when they bump into each other, sometimes they go up and make a mountain. Or sometimes just part gets launched up and makes a cliff. So if you want to know if Swedenborg ever had anything to say about earth changes, he did. This was interesting to him as a young person, but probably Sweden has those layers not because of the Bible flood necessarily, but maybe because they came up from the seafloor. Have there been other advanced human civilizations before? This is the standard model. If you look at the picture at the bottom there, this is what people have been thinking and teaching in schools for a long time, right? There were Australopithecus, some other kinds of interesting breeds of humans. And then one day, about 100,000 years ago, poof, they were extinct and modern humans appeared. And everybody believes that that is what happened. And what I want to draw your attention to is the part on the graph between the 100,000 years and the 6,000 years we've had written history. So somewhere between 180,000 years, we lose the Neanderthals and we get modern humans. But we only have recorded history back about 6,000 years. So how long does it take for a civilization to go from basic human hunter-gatherers to, cell phones? I can't show you my cell phone because I'm underwater and they don't work very good down here. So how much of this time when we couldn't or didn't write down what happened was something happening that we don't know about? It could be a lot, right? 6,000 years is not very long. And in 6,000 years, we went from Egyptian pyramids and biblical times to, now. So it seems like a civilization is maybe something that can arise quickly on a scale that includes tens of thousands of years. But when? If there were lots of advanced civilizations, why don't we find them everywhere? I don't know if you guys have ever seen the show Life After People. Who's seen the show? Raise your hand.
No.
Okay, it's an interesting show where they speculate about how fast things would degrade and fall apart if all of the humans were suddenly gone. How long would the power plants last? How long would the skyscrapers last? How long would roads and bridges last? And what you find if you watch that show is that a lot of materials that we think are so strong and sturdy aren't going to be with us even in 100 years, much less 1,000 years. So actually, things can fall apart pretty rapidly. Most of that show is speculation, but they do try to bring on people who are like materials experts sometimes to talk about how fast they think their material can decay. The other thing is, geologically speaking, the Earth's crust recycles itself. Through processes of tectonic plates going back under each other, there are some technical names for this stuff: layered mantle hypothesis, crustal recycling, whole mantle hypothesis. Like, does the whole mantle get recycled or whatever? But while there isn't maybe a consensus on how this happens, our understanding is that everything on the surface of the Earth will eventually, at some point, no longer be on the surface of the Earth. So that might make it hard to find advanced civilizations. Okay, this is another big topic. We're going to need to understand Randall Carlson's opinion on where Halloween came from. And that's the precision of the equinoxes and archaeoastronomy. And I'm really sad I didn't find an equinox precession. I did have a picture of a number of things that didn't get in here because I just ran out of time. But archaeoastronomy is the idea that the buildings in these ancient city layouts, some of them or all of them, were designed to reflect something in the sky or else to track it. So what you have to understand about archaeoastronomy is that it's a new kind of field, and mostly scientists up till this point have not relied on it to date buildings. The academic tools people use to come up with the dates of this stuff are carbon-14 dating, which allows you with equipment to analyze the decay of carbon atoms. There's context, which is finding items near other items. Like if two items are near to each other, you might try to assume that they were used at the same time. And another thing is geological weathering. Like if you have carbon dated some area and you find another area that looks like it that is similarly weathered, you might guess that those two things are the same age. Why do ancient people preserve astrological data in their buildings? The real answer is nobody knows, because the ancient people are gone and we cannot ask them. But some theories are that they wanted to predict the eclipses and seasonal changes, mainly because eclipses freak people out. So the priestly class needed to know when there was going to be one, so that they could come up with some kind of ceremony or something so that people wouldn't be freaked out. So their followers wouldn't be freaked out. The second thing is changes in agriculture, like the equinoxes. They weren't always printing calendars in these cultures, right? But you still need to know when your last frost date is going to be. So when it's safe to plant the crops, probably. You have to need to know when it's going to get cold again, when they're going to die. So you need to know when your equinoxes are, so you can keep track of those things. So they think that some buildings that are aligned with The stars, various stars, were done to help people calculate those kinds of things. And that's considered sort of a reasonable assertion. Another theory, because a lot of these buildings we now think are temples, right? Like the pyramids, we think they had something to do with their religion. So some people have theorized that some of these buildings were built to count time. I think particularly for the Maya culture, maybe to count time until a period when their god will return, right? At some point, somebody's going to come back or has promised to come back. So that is another theory of maybe why they were trying to track this time. I think Randall Carlson is going to talk about the last thing, which is to detect signs of earth changes and impending cataclysm. So like meteor showers, which I think we're now finally going to get to talking about. This is very important, and I don't want to steal too much thunder from Randall Carlson, but he's going to talk to you about the Taurid meteor stream. And now we're going to talk about Halloween. So what is the Taurid meteor stream? Meteors follow in the wake of a comet called Encke, which was named after the person who discovered it. The Taurids are associated with the constellation of Taurus. So you can see in the picture, it's labeled Taurus. There's a bull. He's got long horns. That's a zodiac sign or constellation that appears every year. If you look where it says the Pleiades, that's the Seven Sisters constellation. It's near the shoulder of Taurus, the bull. And the Pleiades area has two areas near it, which are the radiants of Taurus, of the Taurid meteor stream. Now, Earth passes through this meteor stream twice a year. So you think of Earth going by, and there are like little rocks, and it's going through this period of meteors and stuff in its orbit. And it does that twice a year. The Taurid meteor stream is important because the dates of Earth's passage through it, at least in the fall, or our northern hemisphere fall, are on Halloween, October 31st through November 2nd. So the hypothesis is that all these ancient cultures aren't celebrating this Day of the Dead because it's harvest season necessarily, because it's a different harvest season in the southern hemisphere, but they're all connected by something they can see in the sky. And that is this, Taurus, the Taurid meteor stream, and the Pleiades. Jewish tradition, fascinatingly, and you'll hear him talk about this too, marks this time of year as the time when the Great Flood happened. So Halloween is the result of cultures remembering that a meteor hit and destroyed another ancient world. And that is why it's the Day of the Dead and the day we think about our ancestors and the day when we sort of, I don't want to say celebrate fear, but have memories of scary things that come out. Okay, so this is the Taurid meteor stream. In the white, you can see the little meteors following Comet Encke. So a comet has a lot of junk breaking off of it as it flies through space. And that junk becomes the meteor stream that follows behind it. Sometimes the comet doesn't come around every single year. This one I think does, but most of them don't. But the problem is every time they come through, even if it's, in thousands of years, they still leave this space junk behind. And that is what is intersecting with our orbit. So you can see the green circle is the Earth, and twice a year it goes through the Taurids. And you can see that there's sort of a thicker part and like a thinner part. The other part of it also sometimes causes problems. It's harder to see because when it's coming through one arm of the torrens, you can see it at night in Taurus, but the other time, often you'll be like looking into the sun to try to see it. So people might not be able to see it. So, but on Halloween, they can see it. So, this is a chart of astrological terminology that I didn't know when I was watching this and talking about culmination and ecliptic. I was like, what does it mean? And it's because when you have an observer, like in your brain, you're thinking of them on a flat plane, and then they go, the other lines are in relation to that observer. So when they're giving astronomical observations, they're not talking about like satellite observations. They're talking about a person standing on the Earth observing. So the culmination is the passage of a celestial object across the observer's local meridian. And the ecliptic plane is the orbital plane of the Earth around the sun from the perspective of an observer on Earth. So if you hear him say that, that's all he's going to talk about. Okay. Now, I want to say my first reaction to watching Randall Carlson was to call him out because I was like, this is BS. I don't believe this as a theory for why Halloween happens in October. Because Sweden and Finland, I know because I visited there, have something called Easter witches or påskkärring. That's an Easter hag, or påskhäxa, that's an Easter witch. They celebrate a very Halloween-like tradition where they dress kids up, they send them out into the neighborhood to get candy from all the houses of the neighborhood, but it doesn't happen around Halloween time. It happens at Easter, and not during any point when the Earth is crossing toward meteor stream. What's interesting is the Swedish children all dress as witches. That it's not like America where you have to have different costumes. They all, even the boys, have to be witches, which sometimes they don't like, but they still do because they want candy. Dress up as witches, these little boys. So what is that? This is the part that I have to add because I said, okay, if Halloween is really a holiday that's trying to make us remember meteor impacts that destroy things, what meteor stream might happen around Easter? I was like, oh, there probably isn't one. And I looked it up, and I was wrong. There is a meteor stream that is visible very well in the northern hemisphere, and it's called the Lyrid meteor stream. The Lyrid meteor shower is caused by Comet Thatcher, which will not pass by the Earth in our lifetime, but has left behind a yearly shower of meteors trailing in its wake. This peaks between April 22 and 23, dates that coincide with the Easter season. Now, if you know about Easter, you know sometimes it's in March, sometimes it's in April. So this is sort of a late Easter that this might happen together. The Lyrids are most easily observed in the northern hemisphere, and the oldest written record of the meteor stream is of the Lyrids, and that record is from China in 687 BC. So in the 1600s, Sweden also burned hundreds of witches. They had a change in their law that went from, if there's a witch, they get a fine or some like minor thing. They changed it so if someone's convicted of witchcraft or sorcery, they execute them. And this caused something that was called the Great Noise, which was similar to in Europe when they had the Inquisition. Like, they executed a couple hundred people, which, if you think about the population of Sweden at the time, was a lot of people. So Swedish people and Finnish people think that they celebrate this witch tradition to mark the event of all those people accused of witchcraft losing their life. I won't say they were witches because they almost certainly were not. The great noise ended when they were able to convince one of the kids who had started the testimony to recant and say they had been lying. And that was when they started throwing out evidence from kids and just saying, well, they're a kid, they make stuff up. We're not going to kill people over stories about being abducted by witches. That's how it started. The kids said they had been abducted by witches and Satan. And then it was later determined that that did not happen. However, they would have confessions like this on the other side of the slide, which I found amazing because it says that the devil used to play upon a harp before them, and afterwards go with them that he liked best into his chamber where he committed heinous acts with them. Of course, for some reason, the devil loves to sleep with people. I don't know why. Blah, blah, blah. Okay, so why is it interesting that in this story, the devil has a harp? It's interesting because Lyra is a constellation, the lyre, right? It's a harp-like instrument. So it's interesting that that would be part of the confession. And I realize you may be not able to see that part of the quote because of Zoom putting people on the side there. But when I saw that, I was like, you're kidding. How do these images linger in these stories? Okay, then the bottom part is also important. And he bids them believe that, okay, yeah, I can't read it also because there are people. He talks about that there's a great demon that's greater than the devil.
A dragon.
They had seen sometimes a very great devil like a dragon with fire round about him and bound within the iron chain. And the devil converses with them and tells them that if they confess anything, right, if they tell anybody, he will let the great devil loose, this fiery dragon thing, loose upon them, whereby all Swedenland shall come into great danger. So the devil apparently has control of like maybe a meteor in the Lyra meteor stream or something. This dragon-like thing that has a chain coming off it, like a shooting star, right? Like I don't know. This is my part of it, the Lyra. They say one thing you have to do is if you're going to critique someone's work, you have to add your own thing to it. This thing is my thing about the Easter witches in the Lyra meteor stream. So, what's the deal with the devil and these witches? This gets back to the universal idea of the fallen one. A fallen one is a person or a being that comes to earth from the sky, having been cast out of heaven to spread chaos and evil and made fields of mortals for their souls. And the servants of the fallen one are thought to be witches. The fallen one is often described as beautiful or associated with light, like Lucifer the light bringer. So this suggests the fallen one has an origin as a comet, and his servants are like the meteors in a meteor shower. Some cultures, this is a problem, some cultures viewed sacrificing somebody as the solution for removing the evil presence and averting the catastrophe. So I think Roslyn is going to talk about the Aztec custom of whenever a terrible sign was seen in the sky, somebody was getting human sacrificed. So what's this other part of the story? The other part of the story is civilizing gods and the Great Restart. So, after a meteor destroys your civilization, in a lot of ancient tradition, and there's a big flood, okay, then after all that terrible thing is over, humanity is reduced back to the Stone Age, but someone, or more than one someone, like a pantheon of gods, comes to teach the primitive people who have survived the deluge. Whoever this person is, they have amazing knowledge to share, and they are remembered by the future generations as a god. So Prometheus is a great example. He comes and he brings fire. There was another one, I think Inanna, who had a whole list of things that she brought. People celebrated her in the Middle East. So, yeah, I was going to Google all these guys' names, but there's an awful lot of them. So, okay. But when doesn't that mean aliens came down and taught our ancestors stuff, right? It was aliens. It wasn't aliens. I'm a sociologist, so I'm going to say it wasn't aliens. Why the gods are not aliens? This gets back to something that sociologists know about. That's sort of a sad thing, but I'm going to explain it to you. There's something called cargo cult. A cargo cult is something that happened during World War II when the US and Japan were looking for islands they could control to launch attacks on each other. And a person comes from the sky because they're flying an airplane, and they land in front of these primitive people, or not primitive people, but like an island civilization of hunter-gatherers, right? Primitive is an insulting word. I don't believe that. I don't believe hunter-gatherers are primitive. And I'll explain that in a minute. So the person would come out of the sky in an airplane and would have a lot of cargo, right? Because they're ramping up a war effort. They have to get these supplies places. And so they show up with lots and lots of stuff. And the native people are amazed. Like, look at these people. They came from the sky. They have endless abundance. They have unlimited resources. You know, they must be worthy of veneration. And then we'll start to treat the people sort of like deities, like powerful ones. And then the problem is, at least the problem in World War II, was the story was sort of sad, right? Like they were there on this island, and they had all these interactions with people, and they might have let the people sort of think that they were extra cool, or they might have just felt they were better than those people because there was a lot of racism and stuff like that going on. And then the war ended, and we left. And what happened that was observed on the island afterwards is that the people would start doing things to try to bring the gods back. They made like fake runways, or runways that they were trying to imitate runways that were built by the GIs, but they couldn't do it the same way because they didn't understand the technology. There was one that like had a Birdman tradition. It's just very interesting that if you have enough of a technological unevenness between one civilization and another, the less developed civilization may conclude that the more developed civilizations are gone. So that seems to happen. And you would think, how could this ever happen? I can't go to like Kansas and pretend to be a god because Kansas has the same level of technology as me. Well, the world is not evenly developed, right? Even today, it's not evenly developed. So why would it have been evenly developed in ancient times. It probably wouldn't. So now we have to talk about survivor bias. Who survives a cataclysm? Do any of you feel you would survive a giant flood? Or like the aftermath of one specifically? Who knows hunter-gatherer skills? No hands? No hands. Okay. If an advanced civilization comes up against one of these cataclysms, we are in the group that is probably not going to make it, right? Because we don't know how to grow our own food. We don't know how to clean our own water. We don't have intestines that are designed to deal with like food and water that is not up to the sanitation standards that we have now, right? So if you are a hunter-gatherer right now and there's a cataclysm, you really have an advantage because you're not like suddenly missing your electricity and your iPhone and everything that you need to do your daily life. You can keep going, the way you have. That skill set, being able to make food, preserve it, that's very important. And a lot of us don't have that now. We're specializing in, event decoration or something, right? So in the ancient stories, you would have two groups of people, right? You would have the people who had gone back to the Stone Age, or maybe they'd never left after the cataclysm. Maybe that was just how they did things and how they did things work. And then you had these other group of people, a much, much smaller group of people, sometimes only one person, who were the survivors from the more advanced part of civilization. So, like, if someone from America went up in the sky in an airplane to avoid the floods and destruction from a meteor that hit the Earth, for example, and for some reason they were able to keep flying around and not have to land until all of that was okay. And then they landed in the Amazon, where an uncontacted tribe was, then they might accidentally start a cargo cult. But maybe they would make a deal with that tribe, like, hey, I'll help you, I'll teach you some cool things, and you give me some food and water, because you know where the food and water is, and I don't. Okay. So, what are the actual moral lessons from Halloween if that is the thing that is being represented, right? Some kind of cataclysm followed by some kind of restart. The first lesson is respect the quote-unquote primitive people and the balance of nature, right? If you don't have any primitive people, and if you don't have any people who know hunter-gathering skills, if we were able to wipe that out, like sometimes we think that would be a good thing, right? Nobody should be a hunter-gatherer now. Like, we have iPhones. We should give everybody. There would be nobody to do that part of the story, right? There was no restart of civilization. So there wouldn't be a restart, because that's half of the picture. The second thing, maybe don't be a woman healer, a herbalist, or midwife when an ominous sign appears in the sky. You might get burned as a witch, right? Like, this is something that happened to a lot of people because of the belief in witches. Sadly, lots of women lost their lives. And now if we know that what fosters that kind of belief is this boom star, Randall Carlson could have talked about this, but the belief that a broom star is the thing on the poster at the beginning slide, right? It's like a cone. If you see that in the sky and you think that's a witch, then we might end up burning somebody. The last one, I think it's the most important one, is welcome strangers, no matter how funny they look or strange they are. because they may have some amazing knowledge or gift to confer on your society. And I think that I like that not just in the situation where you're surviving a cataclysm, but also in everyday life. I saw this meme online and I want to read it. It says, Halloween, a day when we get it right. Strangers come to us, beautiful, ugly, odd, or scary, and we accept them all without question. We compliment them, treat them kindly, and give them good things. Why don't we live like that? So I am in favor of bringing back the hospitality tradition. And if you're looking for a moral lesson of Halloween, that would be my interpretation of it. Before I stop sharing this, are there any questions or anything you want to look at a little more?
Hey, Liz, when you talked about the island civilizations and the cargo culture,
Yeah.
when I lived in the Marshall Islands, the island that hosted the native Marshallese had no electrical supply,
Oh dear.
but they bought refrigerators and washing machines as status symbols
Okay. Yeah.
to represent that they were buying into the value of this higher culture, in quotes, large quotes.
Yes.
And they filled the washing machines with water and swished their clothes around in them manually and pulled them out and wrung them dry because it was a status symbol, a representation of your association with the culture that supplied them.
Oh. Wow. So you've seen it in action, you could say.
Yeah, it was crazy.
Yeah, the thing about those, I don't know, it just struck me so a little stressful. Learning about cargo sort of ruined my day because, it just seems so sad of like people trying to replicate this stuff, but they don't know how to do it. And I just thought, like, if I survived a cataclysm, I'm 46 right now. I can easily spend the rest of my life trying to write down all the stuff that I knew from my culture if I was the last person and it was suddenly my job to have to convey it to some other people who didn't understand it. Right? That's a little stressful. So I think I'll go back to stopping the share.
Liz, I have a request or whatever. Can you say again the correlation between the Taurid meteor stream and some impact and when that would have been, and then how that turned into Halloween? Because I didn't quite catch that. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. It's almost time for starting the movie, and he's going to talk all about that. So
okay.
I don't want to take it from him, but basically he believes in a time between 11,200 years ago and 11,500 years ago, at a time when geologists refer to as the Younger Dryas, which is just a geological climate change event. It's not like an age, it's not like the whole thing, it's just this event. He believes that event could have been caused by the Taurid meteor stream, and that the people who were alive then, because that was like 5,000 years before we have written records, right? So at that time, the people who were around, which may have included the civilization of Atlantis, experienced a giant flood event, meltwater 1B, right? And then that changes the Earth in a lot of ways and led to people being afraid of meteors, right? These fears of witches and stories about the thing that fell, right? The thing that fell is a meteor. And also the remembrance of that event as a great time of dying think if you were trying to remember 9/11, like in 11,000 years from now, okay? Like, is that going to be something that you can explain what happened and why it happened if you didn't have like written records of it? Or would you just be like, gee, for a while this culture seemed to get kind of sad around this time. I wonder what their problem was. So Graham Hancock and Randall Carlson both believe that humanity has some kind of amnesia around this event, this flood event that happened. And we're trying to put the stories in the right order. Okay? So a meteor just caused a big flood, melted some glaciers, Atlantis and Lemuria and Neo and Hyperborea, all the different cultures were swallowed up. And we can't figure out where they went, or we don't have good evidence. Because the only thing that survives are like the stone temple things that they built. Like they might have had other things, skyscrapers or whatever, like, but that stuff will be gone. So this is 11,000 years ago. But these cultures remembered things. They remembered some of the cultures were not advanced, and they remembered that advanced people came. Sometimes advanced pantheons came, right? Like you would have a whole bunch of gods who showed up in the north and showed up in Greece, and there would be a group of them, Zeus and Hera and Pluto and all that stuff. And what's interesting about these gods is that have you ever watched the show Hercules? It has a preamble like the ancient gods were petty and cruel, and they plagued the race of mankind with suffering. And if you look at the mythology, the gods don't behave like aliens or like somebody who has a different agenda. They behave like humans, okay? They sleep around, they do war with each other. A lot of them are kind of bad people, but it definitely makes you think that these are things humans might do. So maybe some of those groups were just survivors of more advanced civilizations and not, like a solar savior, one deity. Here's a question. If our planet had two suns, would we have monotheism? I don't know, because the oneness of monotheism is represented in the fact that we have one sun. That's why you have Mithra and Jesus, and all these one solar savior. So it's, or at least some people theorize that. So it's very interesting.
So there's a sort of collective human amnesia about exactly what happened, but the effects of it, the terror, the fear, the mourning of the loss of human life, etc., has survived as Halloween practices. Is that that's pretty much it? Yeah. Okay.
That is the theory.
Thank you.
Welcome. And without further ado, this movie is longer than an hour. If I start playing it now, you'll be able to come back for Roz's presentation kind of when it's done. But if you want to see, because except for the part about the lyrids, none of this is me. This is all Randall Carlson. And I think he presents it very convincingly.
I was going to ask you to put the link in the chat. If he needs to go away and make lunch or whatever and wants to watch the movies at another time, if you can share the link, then,
Okay.
Yeah.
Coming up.
All right. Thank you.
has learned forgotten names. It whispers through the trees. It carries songs of vanished flames upon the autumn breeze. What happened to Atlantis fair, sunk beneath ocean waves serene? A question waits in the silence there. What is Halloween? They carved the pumpkins, lit the fires, as all the veils grew thin. They gathered round forgotten pyres as ancient shadows wandered in. Was that a spirit drawing near, a demon or something in between? Our traditions made to cloak our fear. What is Halloween? What is Halloween? A harvest moon, ripening corn and beans. The witches from scary tales we've told, or echoes 13,000 years old. Did watchers see strange lights on high, fell omens streaking across the sky? Did a prophet dream an ominous dream? What is Halloween? Truth has wandered on with every solstice since. The stories change their faces, the centuries change the sea, but somewhere in the silence still the old bells softly ring. What is Halloween? A warning hidden and unseen. Civilization sleep beneath the tide side. Real secrets still locked inside. Children don playful disguises, and the old question again arises. Maybe someday we'll know what it means. What is Halloween?
So I'm going to move into the spirituality part of this retreat. As we learned from the video and from Liz, various cultures around the world have developed unique ways to honor the dead and to commemorate their loved ones. And we're just going to look at 5 of those in this session. And in chronological order, like from the time that the celebration started. So we're going to look at the Mexican Day of the Dead, Celtic Samhain, the Chinese Qingming Festival, the Egyptian Book of the Dead, and the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And so in these traditions, there's different perspectives on death and the afterlife and rituals around all that, beliefs around all that, and how to maintain connections with those who've passed away, because it's a very human trait that we seem to have had forever, to want to, in some ways, remember those that we love that have passed on and are no longer with us. So, starting off with the Mexican Day of the Dead. Its Spanish name is Dia de los Muertos, Mexican Day of the Dead. So it's a very vibrant and colorful celebration, and its origins are in the indigenous Mexican people from as far back as 8000 BCE, and also incorporates parts of the Aztec celebrations, and they were in the 12th century of CE. So, and there's also beliefs influenced by Catholicism, all wrapped up in the Mexican Day of the Dead. It takes place, as you could predict from all that we've learned so far today, it takes place on November the 1st and the 2nd, and it coincides with the Catholic All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day. It's mostly celebrated in Mexico, but anywhere else where Mexican people of Mexican heritage have moved to, the Day of the Dead is celebrated. So what do people do on the Day of the Dead? They create altars, which are called ofrendas, and they adorn those altars with marigolds and candles and sugar skulls, edible skulls made out of sugar. Those are called calaveras. I don't know about my Spanish pronunciation, but I'll do my best. And then, thinking about their loved ones that have passed on, they also put onto those altars the favorite foods and beverages of the deceased person. And the belief there is that putting out their favorite food and their favorite drinks will guide the spirits back to the living world, to their location, to be with them. They eat a bread known as pan de muerto, bread of death. And they decorate the bread with La Catrina, which is a female skeleton, which you may have seen, as a very famous icon of the Day of the Dead. And the female skeleton is wearing a hat and a colorful dress, but is clearly a skeleton. The most popular kind of dress up for the Day of the Dead is skull masks. So people walk around with masks looking like a skull. Not so much all the other things that we might associate with Halloween. In North America, in Mexico, it's about skulls. Well, when the families gathered around the ofrendas, the altar, it can be actually quite lighthearted, telling jokes about the people that have died and humorous stories about them, and just sort of welcoming their presence and welcoming their memory. But besides gathering around the altar, the decorated altar with all the food and so forth, families go and visit the cemetery where their loved ones have been buried. They clean and decorate the graves, and in whatever way they can, spend time with their loved ones who've passed away, whether that's with photographs or at the grave, or, like I said, telling the stories. So, sort of the beliefs around Day of the Dead, it's a time to remember and celebrate the lives of the people who have died. And it is believed that the border between the spirit world and the real world dissolve around this time of year, the beginning of November, end of October. Which historically, with the sort of history that Randall Carlson gave us, you can understand that if there was a major catastrophic event that happened around the world where a lot of people died, that might be the origin of the belief that the border between the spiritual world and the real world, as we call it, becomes thin at this time. And so they believe that the spirits of the departed return to the living world, whatever this world is, the natural world that we live in, during that time, and that they are feasting, drinking, dancing, and enjoying the music with their loved ones.
Oh.
And their memory is kept alive through storytelling and offerings. So that's the colorful and joyful celebration, the Day of the Dead. Even though it sounds kind of macabre to us, maybe just the name of it. It's actually a joyful and loving sort of celebration. When Samhain is the Celtic sort of Day of the Dead, and Liz referred to this earlier, as traditionally people believe that Halloween is kind of came out of the Celtic celebration of Samhain, and to some extent that's true. But a little background, since for probably all of us in this session right now, we may have roots in the Celtic people. And so they were tribes that lived in Central and Western Europe and Britain, starting from about 2000 to the 1200s BCE. And whatever the location, there was similar language, culture, spirituality, religious beliefs, and traditions. Their religious leaders were druids. Some of the druids were female, which is who I'm trying to impersonate today in my costume. So the Celtic people had a hierarchy of gods. They connected their spirituality very much with nature, as many indigenous cultures do. They definitely believed in an afterlife. And then 4 times a year, at the midpoints between the equinoxes and the solstices, so that's between when the day and night were equal, equinoxes, and the solstices, I forget the definition of a solstice. Anyway, at the midpoint between the 4 of those, they held fire festivals on a mountaintop.
Equinoxes are the days when the day and night are equal.
That's right, but I can't remember what a solstice is.
Solstice, I think that's when it starts changing, like it starts going from getting darker and darker to getting lighter and lighter.
Yes.
Or the other.
No, that would be anyway. Well, anyway, for giving a talk on Halloween, we're kind of a little fuzzy about equinoxes and solstices because those are very important in these celebrations of death. But other cultures tend to celebrate on the equinox and on the solstices, but the Celtic people celebrated at the midpoint between them.
Oh.
Yeah. And so that's when they would hold their fire festivals. And the reasons for the fires were to purify at the beginning of a new season. But basically, even though there's 4 seasons, and there would be 4 seasons in Europe and Britain, being in the Northern Hemisphere, but they divided the year into 2 parts. The light half, which would be the summer, ruled by the sun god Baal, and then the dark half, ruled by Samhain, the god of the dead and the god of the winter. So that's why the celebration around the time of Halloween, this time October, November, is called Samhain because that's the god that they were celebrating, the welcoming Samhain and welcoming what they considered the new year. And so in more modern times, the Celts in Europe and modern Ireland and Britain celebrated Samhain on the evening of October 31st into the day of November the 1st, because as the Jewish people did as well, their day started at sunset and at nightfall. So Samhain celebrated the end of summer and the harvest, and it marked the new year with the beginning of the dark half of the year in winter. They too, as did the indigenous Mexican people and the Aztecs, believed that the veil between the physical world and the spiritual world was lifted during Samhain. I just find it very interesting that that was the belief worldwide, and obviously connected to the possible impact theory during the Younger Dryas, but that I wasn't able to find an explanation why people believed that. It was just the belief. But I think that, as I said, if you had a mass loss of many people that you know, of your family, of whole villages, or whatever would have happened, you would be thinking a lot about the spirits and wondering where they went and maybe feeling their presence in some kind of spiritual way. And that would have been incorporated into the belief that the veil is thin at this time. So when the veil is lifted or becomes thin, there can be interaction between humans on the planet and the spirits of people who died. So the belief during the Samhain celebration was that, similar to in Mexico, the relatives in the spirit world came for food and comfort. So the people would leave out blankets to help them stay warm because it's getting cold at this time of year, and leave out food, their favorite food or specific foods that they prepared for the spirits that are coming. But unlike the Mexican Day of the Dead, they also had some fear about fairies and evil spirits coming looking for mischief. Now, I'm going to say growing up, and I have a lot of Scottish relatives and ancestors, I always thought that fairies were good, like the tooth fairy, but there's actually a long, long tradition of fairies being not good, not having good intentions. And so fairies and evil spirits coming looking for mischief that was part of the fear involved in the celebration. They would have their outdoor fires like they did, 4 times a year, and they left food offerings for the deceased relatives, but they wanted to scare away the fairies and the evil spirits, so they would put on scary disguises and so forth to scare away the fairies and evil spirits, and or to fool the fairies and evil spirits into believing that they themselves were spirits, so that they would be left alone and be unharmed. And then further insurance against being harmed by a fairy or evil spirits, they carried treats around with them to bribe the evil spirits.
Nice.
And to, stay away. And then they also hollowed out turnips and put candles in them. And we heard Liz's recounting of the story of how that all came about. But in memory of Jack O'Lantern, they hollowed out turnips and put candles in them. Not pumpkins, but turnips. And I've never tried to do it with a turnip. I don't quite know how that would work, but that's what they did. So that's the Mexican Day of the Dead and the Celtic Samhain traditions. And you can see similarities, obviously, between them. Now we jump ahead in time to the Egyptian Book of the Dead, which was written about 1550 BCE, and Samhain was 2000-ish. So it's not too far ahead in time. But meanwhile, over there around the Nile, the Egyptian Book of the Dead was written, and it's known as the Book of Going Forth by Day. And it's a collection of funerary texts dating back to ancient Egypt, and it's associated with the journey to the afterlife. There didn't seem to have been any specific day associated with death and resurrection and spirits coming back, but it was a huge part of the Egyptian culture, with many people involved in the industry of mummifying people and burying them, and following all the funerary rites that were needed for the journey to the afterlife. So after being mummified, which was just an incredible procedure that they came up with, the deceased were buried with copies of the Book of the Dead to help them in their journey to the afterlife. And in the Book of the Dead, there are spells and prayers and instructions to guide them through the challenges of the world and into the presence of gods. I think I remember reading that there were 9 levels that they had to go through, so it was very complicated. Anyway, so obviously the Egyptians believed in an afterlife, and that, like I said, when and if the deceased person navigated all the challenges and got down to where the gods were, Osiris would judge them. And then the Book of the Dead would make sure that they got down there, and that eventually, if they did it right, they could be reunited with their body and then live eternally. So that was why it was important to mummify the body and have the body preserved, so that when they finished this journey and were judged to be worthy by Osiris, they could be reunited with their body and continue on. So it's a sort of a bodily resurrection, whereas the Mexican tradition and the Celtic tradition don't really involve any kind of resurrection of the physical body. It's all about the spirit that has left and then the spirit that comes back. But the Egyptians were very much centered in having the body reunited with the spirit and then living eternally in the underworld, which I believe was pictured as literally in the earth, not kind of a spiritual place, but a physical place where you would live forever. All right, the next one I want to talk about is Qingming, the Qingming festival in China. And that started in 636 BCE because there was a specific event that happened. But I noticed when Liz was talking that that's right around the time that the Lyra meteor stream was documented for the first time in China. So interesting that their festival for the dead started right around that time. The Qingming festival, it's also known as the Tomb Sweeping Day, which is a bit of a reference to brooms, but I think it's just literally about keeping the burial sites cleaned up. The story that happened in 636 BCE was that there was a person whose name I can't remember, but who lived in the Qingming locality, who was a sort of a favorite person of the emperor. And that person died in a fire in 636 BCE, which was devastating to the local community because this person was a prominent person and beloved by the emperor. So it was the middle of winter when that happened. And so they started celebrating back in 636 BCE by not lighting fires for a month around the time that that person had died. Of course, that created a lot of problems because in the middle of winter, you need fires to stay warm, you need fires to cook food. And so it caused actually a lot of death over and above the death of the person of whose death they were celebrating. So that went on for about 250 years or something, this annual death-inducing celebration of Qingming. But in 300 BCE, it was moved to April the 4th or 5th, to the springtime. And that also coincides with the annual Lyra meteor stream. So interesting. Not that in the stories there was anything about comets falling or descending gods or any of those symbols that Liz was talking about. But it's just interesting that they moved it to a time when there is a meteor stream. So, and it's associated with the changing of seasons, with the coming of the spring. So during this Qingming festival, families, as they do in the other cultures, visit the graves of their ancestors and they clean and repair the burial places and pay respects to the ancestors. And of course, the ancestors are very important in Asian cultures, much more so than in cultures that are derived from European and Celtic cultures. So during Qingming, they burn incense, they make offerings, and then they engage in fun activities like flying kites and picnicking to honor the deceased. And of course, they can picnic because it's in the springtime. It's also a time to appreciate the beauty of nature, which nature plays a major part in a lot of these more ancient cultures. And so nature and fun and taking care of the graves of the ancestors is really what the focus of Qingming is. Nothing about lifting the veil or anything, just choosing this time to remember those who've died. It's a time to show their respect for their ancestors and strengthen their bonds with the family, both the deceased family and the current family, because they gather together to do this celebration in family units, and time to strengthen their traditions that date back a long time. The belief behind all of that is that honoring your ancestors ensures that you are going to continue to be blessed and protected by your ancestors, who play a much greater role in most Asian spiritualities than in the Western ones, like the Mexican one and the Celtic one. Okay, now we cross over to the current era, to the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And so that book its name is Bardo Thodol, and it's a sacred text in Tibetan Buddhism that originated in the 8th century of the Christian era, which was not long after Buddhism was introduced into Tibet. So this is not an ancient tradition like the other ones. But it's important. It's similar to the Egyptian Book of the Dead in that it's a guide for the dying and the dead, and it gives instructions on how to navigate the intermediate state, bardo, between death and rebirth. Because there's a belief in reincarnation. So the belief is that you die in this existence, then there's this intermediate state that you might maybe correlate with purgatory in Christian teaching, world of spirits and Swedenborgian teaching. There's some kind of intermediate state, bardo, and then you can be reborn. So how this works is the Buddhists, and particularly the monks, they read passages from the Book of the Dead to people that are dying, and also over the body of a deceased person, to help them transcend the cycle of rebirth. Because you're trying to not be reborn as a lesser animal or as another human, but you want to move on to a higher spiritual state. So you're trying to transcend the cycle of rebirth. The belief there is that consciousness continues after death, and then it goes through various stages in the bardo. So it's not just a simple like waiting game. There's stages of examination and purification before being reborn. When you read the Tibetan Book of the Dead, it outlines the process of liberation from the cycle of suffering, because suffering is a unifying theme in Buddhism. So you want to be liberated from suffering so that you are not trapped again. And the teaching is that the deceased must recognize their true nature and avoid being drawn into negative experiences during the bardo in order to achieve a favorable rebirth. And your true nature and so forth is sort of determined by how you lived, what your path was like during your incarnation, your current incarnation, the one from which you've just died. So in the bardo, you sort of get sorted out and try not to go into what they call negative experiences. You might want to call it, maybe in Christian terminology, hellish experiences. You want to avoid that so that you can have a favorable rebirth as a human or maybe as a more advanced being. So just to kind of sum all this up, I hope, of these 5 cultural practices, Samhain, Mexican Day of the Dead, the Qingming Festival, and those 2 Books of the Dead. Obviously, diverse ways in which different societies approach death and afterlife. And there is a common theme in all of them of honoring the deceased, but there's differences in the beliefs and the rituals and the cultural significance, for those experiences. The Celtic and Mexican and Chinese traditions are very much rooted in family and community bonds, coming together to either light fires, to build altars, to have fun together. While the Egyptian and Tibetan traditions are much more concerned with the individual's journey through the afterlife. Not so much about the spirits or the people coming back to visit you, but you really want to make sure that your loved ones can make it through to the end point. So these different practices obviously provide insights into the spirituality around death and the afterlife, and different ways that cultures cope with loss and different ways that they remember their loved ones. Because as I said, part of the human condition, we experience loss, we experience death, we experience the grieving when we lose people that we love, this obviously, and then we try in various ways to remember them and celebrate them. I've known in my own lifetime, the focus of funerals has really been to, rather than the sadness and that sort of thing, more like the celebration of life. I much prefer the terminology that's come around in the last 30 years, celebrating life. And yeah. So now we get to Halloween. So Samhain was being celebrated in Great Britain and I'm not really sure about Europe, but definitely in Britain, the Celtic celebrations in Ireland and Scotland and England continued on through the Roman occupation. But by the third and the Christianization of the country, which happened in the 3rd century in the Christian era and continued to the late 6th century in the Christian era, was when Christianity was becoming the dominant religion and the Celtic ways were being sort of disregarded or just not dominant anyway. So in the 5th century of this Christian era, Pope Boniface tried to Christianize Samhain to kind of bring it into line with Christian beliefs, which had happened with a lot of other festivals of the Celtic and previous cultures, like Yule became Christmas and the spring celebration became Easter. They tried to sort of bring them together. Well, Pope Boniface tried, and I'm not even sure if that's how you pronounce his name, but that's what it looks like to me. Anyway, he tried to Christianize Samhain too, because obviously it wasn't going to go away. So let's like make the best of it and try and make it kind of Christian. So he tried moving it to the 13th of May to be a celebration of saints and martyrs. But despite him doing that and that being an official holy day, still in October, people still lit the ritual fires and continued on with Samhain tradition. So there was a day in May that was for the celebration of saints and martyrs, honoring the dead. But then this other thing was still happening in October. So about 300 years later, in the 8th century, Pope Gregory III said, okay, I give up. And so he made November the time to honor the saints, to kind of bring the two celebrations together. And then not long after that, All Saints' Day, which was November the 1st, the time to honor the saints, came to incorporate some of the traditions of Samhain, as you might expect, since they were happening at the same time. And then I'm not sure on the dates on this, but the evening before All Saints' Day became known as All Hallows' Eve, which was then contracted the way English language and other languages do to be Halloween. In the 10th century, on November the 2nd, another holy day was added, All Souls' Day, and that is a day to pray for the faithful departed who remain in purgatory. And I'm not sure why people would remain in purgatory. Maybe those of you in the room who have Catholic backgrounds would know more about that. Any ideas why anybody would remain in purgatory?
I taught a child who was Catholic, and his family was very Catholic. I don't know if you can hear me, Roz.
Yeah, I can hear you. I'm listening, singing on every word.
And they had a child who was very mentally impaired, and he could not take catechism class, and he couldn't take communion because he couldn't swallow anything. Mm-hmm. And the grandparents were in deep grief about him because he would be in purgatory. Oh, he'd been baptized, but he couldn't take catechism class and he couldn't take communion. And they believed that, you know, buying masses for his soul would maybe help him get out of purgatory. Because he was home taught, I read him the catechism book and I said the rosary with him. And I find that I love saying the rosary. It's a very good meditative practice. And I did the joyful rosary because he was infantile. And I thought, well, if he still has all his celestial angels, I don't want to offend them by talking about blood and destruction.
Right, okay.
You know, in connection with God. So we did that. And the impact it had was the grandparents stopped being so morose about him, which was sort of my goal. I documented it as culturally appropriate reading material for the public schools' benefit, because that's who was paying me to take care of him. And, you know, the idea that you have to be in purgatory because you missed out on some instruction or you weren't baptized or Maybe because you'd been horribly wicked, but you had reformed, but not enough to qualify you to move on directly. Purgatory was where you park people who don't deserve heaven for whatever reason.
They apparently don't deserve hell either. They're just sort of stuck.
Well, they can get afraid out of it.
Is where you go if you're not baptized.
If you're not baptized, or
you go to limbo. You go to purgatory if you die without like confessing your last round of sins or whatever. That's why they have last rites.
Yeah, he couldn't take last rites because he couldn't respond to any of it.
Right. Like you have to say the ritual. You have to say, bless me, Father, I have sinned, and then say what you did and get forgiven and receive absolution.
And absolvite.
Yeah. So like if you die, and also there's like a difference between venial sin and mortal sin. Like if you murder someone, that's a mortal sin. But there are a bunch of sins that don't rise to that level that you still have to confess. But like if you died, you wouldn't necessarily go to hell from them. You might go to purgatory. And then your family can pray for you or whatever so you can get out of purgatory faster.
Just listening and thinking, so much of this sounds man-made. And that I believe that God is good and sometimes man is mad. And some, creating all this layers. I think that it's much simpler than that. And I think man makes it very difficult.
Yes. Well, thanks for that. Yeah. So that's what All Souls Day was, a day to pray for them. And I guess that could help them get out of purgatory and move on to their permanent spiritual destination. Right. So all of that was happening in Britain, the Christianization of Samhain. And that was before the colonization of the USA. So how did Halloween come to the USA? Oh, indigenous. I believe that there was an indigenous celebration of Halloween, though I did not hear Randall Carlson say so. So I'm not really sure if the indigenous people in the North America were celebrating it. Definitely they were in Central America, but I don't know. But once there was colonization in North America, both the Catholic and the Anglican colonies celebrated All Saints' Eve as a religious holiday. But that's all they did. It was just celebrating the saints at that time in the beginning of November. But when there was a lot of Scottish and Irish immigration in the USA because of the potato famine in the 19th century, they brought their All Hallows Eve and Samhain practices with them and continued to celebrate them. And they became popular in the USA. Even though in England they'd sort of died out and we were being colonized pretty much by English people, but they brought that back in the USA. I noticed growing up in Australia, there was not Halloween, and there had been a lot of Scottish and Irish immigration to Australia at the same time because of the potato famine. So it's just an American phenomenon that the people that were living in the United States sort of thought this was fun. This is great. Well, whatever it is that these Irish and Scottish people are doing, we want to do it too. So say again?
We're capitalists. There was money to be made.
Oh, well, at first there wasn't. That did happen, but initially
I think it persisted because there was money to be made.
Yes, sadly, that's often a factor, isn't it? But anyway. At first, I don't really know why it became popular. I mean, it's not in the reading that I did. I didn't really say. But anyway, so that term Halloween had been used in the 16th century. And so Halloween as the contraction, like I said, so in the USA, it just became Halloween and was started to be widely celebrated in the 1930s. Now, I'm going to say I lived in the US as a child until I was 6 years old, and there was Halloween, and my impression was that it had been around forever, but that hadn't been. It only really became big here in the 1930s. And at first, the kind of tricks that people had to do was either like, if you don't give us a treat, we'll do something mean to you, like those mischievous spirits would do. So we might throw eggs at your house or whatever. But also, you could do a trick like a gymnastic feat or recite a poem or some kind of trick, and then you would get your treat. And the treats initially were not candy, but like fruit or baked goods or some kind of treat like that. However, in the 1950s, to Laurie's point, is when the candy companies realized that this was a monetization opportunity. So they promoted giving out candy for the trick or treating. And the whole practice of leaving food and for the spirits of the departed had long gone disappeared, but it sort of maybe reinvented itself as sharing food amongst people, or it descended to sharing candy with people. That's kind of maybe what it was. And the fires, because remember it started with ritual fires. They maybe became sort of those orange-ish kind of lights that we put up, or candles in jack-o'-lanterns or whatever. So the food and the fires sort of remained in the celebration of Halloween in the USA, but in different forms. And in the 1970s, people became, particularly parents, a little concerned about what kind of bad things could be in the candy or in the apples or the baked goods, whatever. So that's when the candy companies started making those little bags of candy that you hand out, because you know that that's going to be safe. So there again, the whole notion of a lack of safety or possible harm at Halloween surfaces again unconsciously, because most people in America had no idea that this had something to do with Samhain and the fairies and the evil spirits coming to get you. But there's still this fear and fear of harm that comes up in Halloween centuries, millennia later. And also the Samhain practice of dressing up as something ghostly or scary to scare away the evil spirits or to trick them continued on. Initially, it was all about scary costumes, skeletons, ghosts, witches, and all of that kind of thing. But I read an interesting blog by Reverend Josephine Robertson. She's an Episcopalian priest. And then she recently wrote in her blog, maybe 2 years ago, something like that, that she sort of encourages people to confront their dark side on Halloween. Her perspective is that it's a time to openly confront our thoughts and feelings about death. And because her point is that Halloween has sort of become sanitized, and people now will dress up as fun little princesses or characters from movies or whatever. I know myself with my children with Halloween, my rule was I don't want anything that looks like it came from hell. And so my kids were like Ninja Turtles and angels and sweet little things like that. But Josephine Robertson is saying, no, the early Hallows Eve celebrations were all about confronting death and accepting death and even celebrating death. So she's saying, go back to that if you can. So now I've sort of opened my mind a little bit to that. Like maybe it isn't so bad. I still don't like seeing skeletons walking around, but I can see both with the ancient history of it and the way that it's celebrating our deceased ones in a sort of scary way. But anyway, she's saying also in 21st century living in the United States, we're mostly removed from death. Some of us, like Janice and I, have worked in hospitals and we've been around death, so we're not maybe as removed from it as others, but most people maybe have seen 1 or 2 people die, maybe not even that, being with somebody as they're dying. We're very removed from death in our 21st century lifestyle. And so that her sort of psychological interpretation is that we wear scary costumes to manifest or show like our fears and dreams and taboos about death that we can't actually talk about in day-to-day life, that are sort of suppressed because we have lack of experience or exposure to death. So she's saying Halloween is becoming a way to further remove us from our thoughts and fears about death, about taboos and our dark inner selves. And she says, be conscious of that if you're willing, and take the time at Halloween to think about what your fears are and what is taboo, and talk to your family about death and what your desires are for your own death. Use it as a positive thing instead of a time of being scared and scaring other people. So that's the story of Halloween. Now, I wanted to move on from cultural celebrations of Halloween and Day of the Dead or Books of the Dead to look at the Hebrew scriptures and the Christian scriptures, which together we call the Bible, and Swedenborgian perspectives too on the issues that are associated with Halloween. So looking at the Hebrew scriptures and keeping in mind that these were written from 1200 to 165 BCE, so sort of overlapping with a lot of the development of the Day of the Dead and the Books of the Dead and the Qingming festival. So often death is portrayed as a natural part of human existence, and it's not really associated with a clear notion of an afterlife in the Hebrew scriptures. It's also considered sometimes to be a consequence of sin, and it's described in metaphorical terms often, especially in the Psalms, where death seems to be a metaphor for any kind of dying to self or spiritual transformation. Mourning practices that were described in the Hebrew scriptures. There's a place in the Bible, Amos chapter 8, verse 10, where Amos said that the Divine One would turn your festivals into funerals and all your songs into funeral dirges as a punishment for sin, and describing this turning as mourning as if you had lost your only son. So the implication of that is, by the time Amos the prophet wrote that, or that was written, that biblical mourning involved refraining from feasts and songs and temple rituals, and that there was funerals and songs, special songs that were sung. And losing your only son would probably be a more intense kind of experience of mourning for anybody, but especially biblically. Another example is the high priest Aaron. After 2 of his sons were killed, he refused to eat animal sacrifices, saying it would not please the divine at a time when he was mourning his son's death. And that's from the book of Leviticus. So there was definitely sort of ritual around mourning. And like I said, it's refraining from eating and temple rituals. In the Hebrew scriptures, there's not a lot about resurrection. And of course, resurrection is part of the story for all of the festivals of the dead, that there have been people that have died, they've been resurrected as a spirit, or maybe in the Egyptian case, they will be rejoined with their body and then resurrect as a complete person. So resurrection is sort of an important part of the understanding of any of these, of the spirituality of death and celebrations of death. But there's not really a concept of resurrection in the Hebrew scriptures. However, there are 3 instances of prophets raising people from the dead. Elijah raised a young boy from death in 1 Kings 17, and then following him, Elisha brought the son of the woman of Shunem back to life after his death. And then after Elisha died and his body was buried in a tomb, a dead man's body was thrown in there. But when that new dead body touched the bones of Elisha, he became resurrected, came back to life. So there are instances of resurrection in the body, but not so much resurrection of the spirit after death. And there's nothing really comprehensive at all, like there is in the Christian scriptures and in Swedenborg. As far as honoring the dead, there's definitely emphasis in the Old Testament about honoring the dead through burial and remembrance. There's Levitical laws about how to go about that, and always very respectful burial of patriarchs and other important figures. And there was also a practice of honoring the anniversary of the day that loved ones died. But there wasn't any special holy day or feast day for honoring the dead like there was in some of the other cultures. Although Yom Kippur is part of the New Year. It's the Day of Atonement before the New Year starts with Rosh Hashanah. And during Yom Kippur, there are services that people conduct. These called memorial services where you remember loved ones. It's a part of Yom Kippur, but it's not set apart as a separate day or separate feast day. But it's sort of the closest that you might come to a celebration of the dead, to remember loved ones, more along the sort of Qingming kind of line rather than the Celtic one. Then afterlife. So in the Hebrew scriptures, there's a variety of views about the afterlife, but it's also not fully fleshed out. Pun not intended. Sheol is a term used to describe the realm of the dead, and it's obviously not a good place, and it's sort of under the earth or something like that. And it's a shadowy and ambiguous place where the souls of the deceased dwell. There is the term the heavens that comes up a lot in the Hebrew scriptures, but it tends to mean the sky, like what's above us is the heavens, not necessarily a spiritual kind of heaven. And hell, being Sheol, is not quite clear whether that's actually under the literal ground or is it some other kind of place. Now, there are some teachings in the Hebrew scriptures about contacting departed people, which is obviously what people during the Mexican and other death celebrations, there's, because of the veil being lifted, there's a conscious intention to contact people who've died. Well, from their neighboring cultures and from their own ancestral history, the Hebrew people knew about the possibility of contacting people that have been departed, and they believed it was real, that you really could do that, but they were forbidden to do so. In Deuteronomy 8, there must never be found among you anyone who conjures up spirits, practices the occult, or seeks the dead. So even though they knew about it, they knew that they shouldn't. However, a rather famous story in 1 Samuel is when King Saul, he'd sort of lost favor with the divine, and he was in a battle situation, as he often was, and he didn't know what was going to happen or what he should do next. And he tried asking the divine for guidance and wasn't getting any. So he decided to ask a medium who lived in a place called Endor to get advice for the battle. But previous to that, it says that Saul, and this was in 1 Samuel 28, Saul had removed the mediums and the magicians from the land because he was trying to keep everybody in line with the teaching that you're not supposed to do that. But he did go to this woman, a medium, and he said, use your ritual pit to conjure up for me the one I tell you. And first of all, she said, but I can't do that. You're not allowed. And he said, you'll be fine. Do it for me. So she did do that, and she brought up Samuel. Samuel had previously been advising King Saul. So she brought up Samuel, and Samuel at first was angry with Saul for disturbing him and bringing him up like that. But he told him, tomorrow, both you and your sons will be with me. So that tells you a little bit about resurrection, that he was saying you're going to die, and you and your sons as well. But you'll be with me in this afterlife kind of experience where you can talk and be brought up by mediums to talk to people on earth. And actually her prediction, Samuel's prophecy to Saul that he would die the next day actually came true. I don't know about the you will be with me bit, that part isn't spoken of, but definitely it did come true. Later on in the book of Isaiah, another prophet spoke to Isaiah about the wayward Israel nation. And he said, the people are going to say to you, Isaiah, they will say to you, seek oracles at the pits used to conjure up wonderworld spirits from the magicians who chirp and mutter incantations. Should people not seek oracles from their gods by asking the dead about the destiny of the living? Of course, the answer is people should not do that. But the point of my bringing that up was that was still continuing on throughout the whole prophetical period in the Hebrew scriptures, that people had pits or bowls that they would use to bring up spirits, and they would actually record in the bowls who they had brought up and what kind of prayers people were asking for. And a lot of it was like help with a marriage or help with getting along with the in-laws or help with the crops and stuff like that. Not always about the destiny of the living. So there was contact with departed people in the times of the Hebrew scriptures, but it was theoretically forbidden, but people did it anyway, which is how a lot of us live our lives. Or, still things are forbidden, but we do them anyway. All right, contact with angels. That is throughout the Hebrew scriptures. Lots of stories of angels or the angel of the Lord appearing to people, speaking with people. Sometimes the angels that would appear look like other people, and the humans couldn't differentiate between the angels and normal people. Some examples are Hagar and Ishmael were saved by the angel of the Lord when they were sent out into the desert. There were 3 angels that visited Abraham and Sarah. There was an angel that rescued Lot and his family from the destruction of Sodom. Many times throughout Jacob's life, and Jacob's name was changed to Israel, but many times he came across angels that guided him through his process. The Passover story features the angel that passed over the houses of the Israel people and saved them from death. There was angels that an angel, I think, that rescued Daniel and his friends from the furnace. Many other stories. So it seemed like the Hebrew people accepted interaction with angels or messengers of the divine, but they considered them to be subordinate beings to the divine, but not human. It's sort of a separate creation, and that their job was to bring the divine will to earth and carry out divine wishes for humans. They often depicted them in their art as winged and in white robes, but obviously they could take human form and not be winged or wearing white robes. And then when it comes to contact with evil spirits and demons, this is sort of like the don't conjure up spirits kind of thing, but there was a belief in demons and unclean spirits. Unclean spirits is sort of like the purgatory thing, were spirits of people that were not ritually buried or not buried properly, and their spirit would just stay on the earth and not move on to any kind of afterlife. So they believed in those unclean spirits and demons, and Nephilim were the fallen ones, interesting from the astrological point of view. There is the one story about King Saul being tormented by an evil spirit, and it says it's an evil spirit from the divine. It seems like the divine sent an evil spirit to torment him, but David played the lyre and soothed Saul. So that's kind of about their contact with spirits and angels and evil spirits. The question comes up because of the things that Liz was talking about earlier about the apocalypse and flood and a new heaven and a new earth, because those themes exist in all those other cultures that we talked about. So, of course, as we probably all know, the Hebrew scriptures do have a story of a flood, which involves Noah and his family and all the animals surviving in a box-like ship. And people who've done sort of literal timelines of the Bible say that that would have been around 2500 BCE. Not sure how that lines up. No, it doesn't line up with the Younger Dryas, does it, Liz? But that's on a literal level, interpreting the Bible. That's when that would have been. But as a result of that flood, all other human and animal life was destroyed, and the divine promised never to destroy the life on earth again. It kind of like the divine did a restart. However, in the 8th century BCE, so much later in time, Isaiah the prophet wrote this in Isaiah 66. Look, I'm ready to create new heavens and a new earth. Obviously, these are the words of the divine. I'm ready to create new heavens and a new earth. The former ones will not be remembered. No one will think about them anymore. So he is predicting a time when there'll be a mass extinction again and something new will come. And it actually contains a lot of similar sort of predictions, like stars falling from the sky, the moon not shining anymore, which sounds a lot like the kind of meteorological impact stories, but written in a scriptural way. So new heaven and a new earth is predicted at the end of the Hebrew scriptures. And of course, it comes up again at the end of the Christian scriptures. And those Christian scriptures were written from 50 to 100, more or less, in the Christian era. So now taking a look at the Christian scriptures in the Bible, what the perspectives are from there. So death is seen as a result of sin, similarly to the Hebrew scriptures, but there's also the concept of eternal life and salvation through faith in Jesus Christ. And so this eternal life and salvation is kind of a new concept that comes up in the Christian scriptures, based pretty much on the death and resurrection of Jesus. And it provides hope for believers in Jesus that resurrection and eternal life are possible for them as well. In mainstream Christianity, death is seen as the separation of the soul from the body. It's also understood as a transition from earthly life to an afterlife. There are definitely resurrection stories and teachings in the Christian scriptures. The New Testament does teach the bodily resurrection of the dead, particularly through the teachings of Jesus, or how they're interpreted. And Jesus did raise 3 people from the dead during his ministry that's recorded. One was Lazarus, and then he told a parable about Lazarus being immediately resurrected after death and what happened to him. And then a young man in the town of Nain whom he brought back to life, and there was the daughter of the Roman soldier Jairus. So there was obviously resurrection back into bodily life. That doesn't tell you anything about resurrection into an afterlife, but that you can come back from death, I guess. Now, there is a story in the Christian scriptures about Jesus being transfigured, and 3 of the disciples saw him talking with Moses and Elijah. And so that implies that Moses and Elijah continued in a spirit form after their death, eons ago in ancient Hebrew times. And the Apostle Paul talks a lot about resurrection, affirming the resurrection of dead at the end of time. So mainstream Christian belief really is that, in theory anyway, that's a future event, that eventually the dead will be physically resurrected to face judgment. But a lot of Christians believe that good people are resurrected right away and become saints that are looking after you. And so if that can happen for saints, maybe it can happen for all of us. And a lot of times Christians will also referring to the loved ones watching over them from heaven. So the sort of common belief seems to be that resurrection happens right away and you're a spirit in heaven or hell straight away, even though there is a teaching about the resurrection in the future time, or a bodily resurrection in the future time. A little confusing. Okay, afterlife. What's the perspective of the Christian scriptures on the afterlife? So it's a much more developed understanding of the afterlife than in the Hebrew scriptures, with concepts of heaven and hell, eternal life, and possible eternal separation from God, either unity with God or separation from God forever. Most Christians believe in some form of heaven and hell, and Christian believers anticipate an eternal life in the presence of God in heaven for believers, but non-believers or sinners are destined for punishment in hell. And some people do believe in very awful things that can happen to people in hell, burning in hell. When it comes to honoring the dead, the Christian scriptures emphasize the importance of definitely doing that, but there's no specific rituals that are recommended. I think pretty much the rituals that Christian people do sort of grew out of the Judaic ones. Christians are encouraged to remember the departed and maintain a sense of hope through faith in the resurrection. and also hope that your beloved ones have gone to heaven, as we would say. Traditional practices include funeral ceremonies, prayers for the deceased, and veneration of saints. And these rituals are intended to offer comfort to the living and to honor the memory of the departed. But it's not at any specified time of year, like with the festivals of the dead. And there's also not any like specific time when the dead are supposed to come back to you. Not in Christianity. Contact with angels. We saw that in the Hebrew scriptures, there was a lot of contact with angels, and that continues in the Christian scriptures. Many stories about angels speaking with Jesus or helping him or other people, whether it's in person or sometimes in dreams. In this Christian scriptures, they can appear in human form and they don't have wings. Nowhere does it say that they have wings. Like Janice was talking about human traditions or people adding things, wings seem to be an explanation for how angels can appear and disappear, and how an angel can fly over the Hebrew people in Egypt at the Passover. Like, it's sort of a way to explain how they get around. And also the fact that they can appear in the sky, like a whole host of them talking to the shepherds when Jesus was born. And it's also a way to indicate that angels are not human the way we are. They're a separate race of people, a separate group, of separate kind of creation, and they have wings. So that's kind of the concept of angels. As far as contacting departed people, Jesus and the early Christian writers didn't seem to be concerned about or talking about, warning against contacting departed people. But the initial Christians were Jewish, and they would have no doubt remembered the teachings and the prohibition against contact with spirits. But at the end of the Christian scriptures in the book of Revelation, in chapter 21, which is at the end of the book of Revelation, but as for cowards, unbelievers, detestable persons, murderers, the sexually immoral, and those who practice magic spells, idol worshippers, and all those who lie, their place shall be in the lake that burns with fire and sulfur. So that seems to be a reiteration of the don't do any of this magic stuff or trying to reach out to spirits, or you're going to end up in that horrible place where you burn with fire and sulfur. And so along those lines, too, contact with departed people, but specifically contact with evil spirits or demons, which in the Christian scriptures are not the ones that have departed necessarily. There is a belief in the existence of evil spirits. They're also known as demons. And the belief was that they could take over people's lives and cause physical illness and obviously mental illness. So in several instances, Jesus removed evil spirits from people and healed them from the trauma of being oppressed by those evil spirits. And he did empower his followers to do the same, though currently there are some exorcism practices. As a nurse, I've even seen a priest come in to do an exorcism to remove evil spirits, but it's not really a common part of Christianity now. And so, of course, we have to look at the apocalypse and flood and new heaven and new earth themes in the Christian scriptures, because it's surfaced everywhere that has anything to do with dead.
Did you really see an exorcism?
I was not in the room, but there was a child that was very sick, and the family said, well, I guess we need an exorcism. And a priest came up and they pulled the curtains around and they were saying prayers or doing whatever needed to be done. And to be honest, I don't remember whether the child got better then or not. I don't. I just remember like, wow, this is like that movie.
That's cool. Amazing.
Yeah. And it's not just Catholics. There's a whole exorcism ritual in Protestant religions too, but it's not used very often that I know of. Have you ever seen anything like that, Janice?
Roslyn, it was bringing a memory back to me when we were starting to take pediatric patients in the PACU before Temple Children's was built. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you were with us then.
No.
So we were getting pediatric patients after they were sedated from having a CAT scan or MRI.
All right.
And I took care of a 3-month-old Korean baby. And they don't come visit. They're sick.
Oh, okay.
Something in their religion, but they did send some type of priest to do an exorcism. I wasn't in the room when it happened because it was after recovery.
Oh, right.
They were recovered and they were going to get ready to go home, or I don't know if they were going home or back to wherever they were transferred from. I can't remember. What really sticks out for me is that they brought a religious person in to do some type of exorcism for this 3-month-old.
Wow. And it's scary to think about an evil spirit possessing a 3-month-old.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a thing. It's still a thing. Right.
I was in the 90s.
Yeah. So my experiences would have been before, 90s and early 2000s. So we can say it was a thing, but we don't really know now.
Right.
So anyway, kind of the apocalypse, flood, and new heaven and new earth themes, how do they show up in the Christian scriptures? There are some hints in the Gospels about the apocalypse that's going to come, but it's very clearly described in the book of Revelation at the end of the Christian scriptures, especially Revelation chapter 16. It talks about the destruction of people and the earth after the divine anger is poured out on the earth from 7 bowls. Interesting that they're bowls, because bowls were associated with the magic and the contacting of spirits in the Hebrew scriptures. And that is also where the Battle of Armageddon is talked about in Revelation 16. And then so that's kind of like it's not necessarily a fire apocalypse, but just a massive destruction of people. There is a bit of a flood, not a big one, a little flood in the book of Revelation when the woman clothed with the sun is chased by the serpent, and the serpent spews out a flood, but the earth swallows up the flood, so it doesn't actually harm her. But so there is definitely apocalypse and flood present, but not present in the Christian scriptures. And there is a new heaven and a new earth as well being promised. So there's the apocalypse in Revelation 16. A couple chapters later, Revelation 21. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and earth had ceased to exist, and the sea existed no more. So that memory of a massive event that wipes out humankind or causes a lot of destruction, whether it's an apocalypse of flood or what other kind of cause, and then a establishment of heaven and earth, comes through all those other ancient cultures and comes through in the literal statements in the Hebrew scriptures and in the Christian scriptures as well. So the themes that I've looked at here biblically are death, resurrection, mourning, honoring the dead, that those are all part of life, but it's not for any specific time of year, just as it happens. There is no specific time when the veil is said to be thinner or when it could happen, like there is in the sort of Halloween traditions. Hell is more developed concept than heaven, because I think people are more concerned about what's going to happen, because everybody's messed up in some way or other and is afraid that they're going to end up in Sheol or burning in a lake of fire. Throughout the Bible, there's contact with angels, with evil spirits, with departed people. What is forbidden is to initiate contact with dead people or with spirits. And throughout, there are stories of flood and apocalypse, followed by a new heaven and a new earth. So that's kind of the spirituality about Halloween as it's presented in the texts of the Hebrew scriptures and the Christian scriptures. But now, because Deborah's Tree is a Swedenborgian ministry, I just want to take a look at Swedenborgian perspectives on all of this. And so Swedenborg started writing his theological works in 1749, and there are people who follow those perspectives and those teachings still. So that's kind of the time frame, the most recent, not quite the most recent, but a recent perspective to look at. So first of all, death. Swedenborg taught that death is a transition from the physical world to the spiritual world, and that in the spiritual world, a person continues to live as a spiritual being. In Swedenborgian theology, death is considered a transition from the physical world to the spiritual world, and that you continue consciously in the afterlife. So here's a quote from his book, Heaven and Hell. When we die, we simply move from one world into another. This is why, in the inner meaning of the word, death means resurrection and a continuation of life. So just a little explanation what that means about the inner meaning of the word and how death can have an opposite meaning, meaning resurrection and continuation of life. Swedenborgian theology includes the notion that everything in the Bible is written symbolically, sort of a sacred symbology, which Swedenborg calls correspondences, and that what appears on the literal words that are written in those texts of the Bible doesn't necessarily convey on first blush what the spiritual meaning is, but there is a deeper meaning that has to do with the life of the spirit and how we are transformed into better people. And so death, even though it seems to be about the body dying, it's really about the transition that we make into the spiritual world and continuing to live. Okay, resurrection. Because as I mentioned before, resurrection is important for understanding any kind of celebration of relatives who've died. Swedenborg wrote about a spiritual resurrection where individuals rise in the afterlife with a spiritual body that reflects their inner state, not their physical state that they had in the world. And so that resurrection is based on your inner character. And it's not going to be at some future time. It's within a couple days, as measured in physical time from when you die. The teaching is that people initially spend some time in the world of spirits between heaven and hell, which is a common kind of understanding throughout different cultures. And in that world of spirits, people's true motivation and life wisdom is all sort of sorted out. And people then find a place in heaven as an angel or in evil as an evil spirit. So obviously Swedenborgian teaching is that angels are not a separate creation, but they're just people who have become better human beings and are now an angel in heaven, and that evil spirits are not some kind of separate creation either. They're just people who've chosen to not be nice in this life and want to continue to do that in the spiritual world so they can live in hell. Here's another quote from Heaven and Hell. Angels never feel happier than when they are welcoming the dead into the life of eternity and introducing these new arrivals into heaven. I actually thought that they would introduce the new arrivals into the world of spirits, but he said it makes angels very happy to take them to heaven. So what does Swedenborg teach about the afterlife? Well, he describes a very complex and detailed afterlife, much more so than in the Christian or Hebrew scriptures, and really more detailed even than the Egyptian and Tibetan, which have a lot to do with the path after life. But the whole picture in Swedenborg is a lot more detailed. He talks about 3 degrees and 2 realms in both heaven and hell, and they're characterized by the kind of state of loving kindness and the state of wisdom in people, and that's how it's divided up. He says that individuals are drawn to spiritual communities that align with their inner spiritual growth and development while they were human on earth, and it's regardless of their religious beliefs on earth. If they use their religious beliefs to grow spiritually, then they can find their place in heaven. Another interesting and sort of a new concept in Swedenborg is that the environment around people in the spiritual world, whether you're talking about hell or the world of spirits or heaven, it accurately reflects their inner states, and like a projection of what's going on within you is projected on the outside. There are some spiritual teachings currently in the world right now that when you can affect what's happening around you. If you think happy thoughts, then happy things will come to you. It's that sort of concept, but he expounds it a lot more deeply. And another teaching in Swedenborg that's different from any of the others that I've read about is that people are married in heaven unless they prefer celibacy or polygamy or something. But marriage, people who've been married while living on earth can continue to be married in heaven if they want to be, stay together, and that people might find a different partner, or if you've never been married, you will find a partner, but that marriage is definitely part of life in heaven, not necessarily in hell. Here's a little bit from Heaven and Hell about how people find their paths after they've spent some time in the world of spirits. I think of it as sort of like advanced therapy, where they like figure out like who they really are and what they want to be. In the world of spirits, you can see paths, some leading to heaven and some leading to hell, each one leading to some specific community. Good spirits travel only the paths that lead to heaven. Evil spirits travel only the paths that lead to hell. So it's not like a judgment and you're sent there, but it's like a revelation to yourself, like, oh, this is where I'm going to go. This is where I'll be comfortable. I'll be comfortable in this community in heaven. Or, oh, this is where I'll go. There's other people like me that kind of like to be mean and nasty, and I'm going to go down that path and live with them in hell. Yeah, that is, yes, Janice, that is a Swedenborgian teaching. It's not about condemnation. It's about finding the place where your spirit resonates. And there are some Swedenborgians who say that can be changed. You can be living in hell and decide that you don't want to be mean anymore and be gradually transformed and then find a place in heaven. Not all Swedenborgians believe that. I'm sitting on the fence. I sort of believe that the divine can do anything.
Interruption has knocked off Lori. I'm going to admit her.
Okay. Yeah, because I can hear sirens and stuff. Something's going on in the hood.
Something's going wrong. Maybe the apocalypse is starting.
Very wrong. I think it's because of what we're talking about. We have such a powerful...
I'm manifesting something scary by talking about the end of the world. There were people in 2017 who have astrology software and thought they had found the woman clothed with the sun 17. Because it's the constellation of Virgo, and then the planets are like, she has 12 stars, and it's 9 stars in the constellation following Virgo, plus 3 planets were in alignment, so they were appearing there, so they could have been mistaken for 12 stars, and Jupiter was transiting through her abdomen area on the constellation of Virgo the Virgin. And so these Christians were like, oh my gosh, it's the apocalypse. Well, it's 2023 and we're still here. So it probably didn't happen in 2017. But maybe there's going to be a sign in the sky. Who knows?
Are you saying in 2017 they discovered that had happened when the book of Revelation was written, or that it happened in 2017?
This star software that they can use to simulate what the stars are going to look like.
Oh, I see.
Back in time.
Welcome back, Lori.
Yeah, just an interesting thing. I mean, they were probably wrong about it. Well, because in that, Jupiter would have had to been the baby, right? That's going to become a king, which made sense to them because Jupiter is a king planet.
Mm.
You know, maybe it's not that. Maybe it's going to be a comet or something else. So, world is still here, and it's 2023.
Yep, thank you. And Lori, welcome back. I've still got a few more things to say about Swedenborgian customs. Are pretty much similar to other Christians, but the focus is more on the person's life and their spiritual growth and development rather than putting a lot of elaborate rituals. In fact, when my parents died and we were at the funeral home, the funeral director said, oh yes, you Swedenborgians, all you ever want is just a pine box. You don't really care. You know, it was kind of our reputation. Like, it's not all about the fancy burial. It's all about the life after death. And As in Christianity, there's not a festival dedicated to honoring people who've passed on or a practice of honoring death anniversaries particularly, and no particular time when the veil between the worlds is thinner or more impenetrable. It seems like there's always presence of angels and spirits around us, regardless. And there is the concept that once you do progress to a heavenly community after death, that you are perfected even then, heaven and hell. Angels of the inmost heaven are constantly being even more perfected in wisdom, and that this happens differently than for angels of the outmost heaven. So it's sort of like that's the focus, is the continuing transformation into being a better human or a better angel, rather than the sort of burial practices. When it comes to contact with angels and departed loved ones and evil spirits, which has been part of all of the traditions we've looked at, people in the spiritual world in Swedenborgian theology can stay in close spiritual contact with loved ones on earth. They assist in our regeneration to become a better person, or our degeneration to become people who want to live in hell. And angels offer us wisdom and ways to be loving, and evil spirits offer us twisted thinking and ways to be self-centered, and we get to choose which influence we want moment to moment. So there's always a sort of a contact with people who have passed on. And it is possible to talk with spirits and angels, but it's dangerous unless we're being led by the divine. And that comes from Secrets of Heaven. While a person lives in the world, they are so far, I'll just read it because it's written in masculine terms and I don't like that, but I'll read it that way. While a person lives in the world, he is so far as his interiors, thus his spirit, are concerned, in contact with other spirits. We are in contact with other spirits. And then also from heaven and hell. Talking with spirits is rarely allowed nowadays, though, because it is dangerous. But there is that footnote to that if you're in a state of faith in believing, and if you're being led by the divine, it's not harmful to be talking with spirits. Okay, what's going on with apocalypse, flood, and new heaven and new earth in Swedenborg? So, as I mentioned earlier about the Bible having an inner meaning, the sacred symbology, according to that, the flood in Genesis describes a flood of false ideas that destroyed religion at that time. And that comes from Secrets of Heaven. The flood symbolizes the false ideas that still swamped the people of that time. And the apocalypse and the final battle in Armageddon symbolize a spiritual battle of truth versus falsity that tries to destroy a new spiritual state. So that, like, for each one of us, as we are moving into maybe a better spiritual state, there is a sort of an apocalypse and an Armageddon going on while you struggle with who you used to be and who you're trying to become. The new heaven and the new earth. In Swedenborgian theology, as Liz mentioned earlier, there have been 4 spiritual eras. Again, other cultures also talk about previous worlds, but Swedenborg talks about the most ancient era, the Jewish era, and the Christian era, which we're in now. And at the end of each era, there's been a judgment, and sometimes it's described as a flood or an apocalypse in the Bible. But after the judgment, a new era begins, which is described in the Hebrew scriptures and the Christian scriptures as a new heaven and a new earth. And so then Swedenborg expounds on the end of the Christian era and the last judgment, and he predicts a new era that he called the new church. And it's symbolized in Revelation by the New Jerusalem descending from heaven, which is something that all Christians hold as a new time that will eventually come. There's a quote from the Last Judgment, the book he wrote called Last Judgment. We can see then that the new heaven and the new earth mentioned in the prophets in the Old Testament are not the new heaven and the new earth mentioned in Revelation. When the Lord was in the world, he brought into being the new heaven and the new earth mentioned by the prophets. So that's kind of like the culmination of what Isaiah was talking about. But he's now bringing into being the new heaven and new earth mentioned in Revelation. which is what Swedenborg calls the new church. So here's my theory about the era of the new church. Liz mentioned that she added something more to her research of what Carlson said. So here's what I've added to my research. So in the past, remember, this is just a theory that just came to me in the last couple of weeks. It's not at all researched, and you can poke holes in this all you want, because I'm perfectly fine. In the past, there have been major apocalyptic events that have occurred that changed life on Earth. For instance, there was an asteroid impact that wiped out the dinosaurs. And then, apparently, another impact, whether it was a comet or an asteroid, changed the climate and wiped out some human cultures and sank some cities and caused a lot of damage at the end of the Ice Age, the time of the Younger Dryas. Well, perhaps upheavals and changes in collective human spirituality manifest or correlate to changes, sometimes apocalyptic, in the planet. Or maybe it works the other way around, that there are apocalyptic changes in the planet which then bring about a change in collective human spirituality. And I'm also kind of thinking about this, about the Swedenborgian teaching that the spiritual world is a projection. What you see in the spiritual world is a projection of what's going on within you. That might also work to some extent in this plane of existence, that when there's changes in human spirituality, there's changes in the world around. When there's upheavals in spirituality, there's upheavals in the planet. You know, like I said, it's a theory. So there have been three major climate changes identified by scientists: the oldest Dryas, the older Dryas, and the younger Dryas. And today we were talking more about the younger Dryas. But perhaps around 11,900 BCE, the most ancient era ended with the older Dryas. There was evidence that there were Cro-Magnon communities at that time, and perhaps those were the most ancient era, and it ended with the climate change of the older Dryas. And then perhaps the ancient era ended with the younger Dryas events, which was around 11,000 BCE. And at the time of the younger Dryas, there's evidence of hunter-gatherer civilizations and possibly more advanced civilizations that were destroyed in the major flooding. But maybe that was a climate change associated with the end of the ancient era. The next era in Swedenborg is the Jewish era, and it's much later in time. But maybe the end of the Jewish era, maybe, which would have been like when the temple was destroyed in 70 AD in Jerusalem. Perhaps the end of that era correlates with flood events that were reported in Rome and Egypt from 170 BCE to 175 CE, which sort of covers Jesus's lifetime and the beginning of the Christian church. Flood events were reported. Maybe that's a climate or a local climate correlation with an end of the Jewish era. And then perhaps the end of the Christian era and the beginning of the new church era that's been prophesied both in Swedenborg, definitely. Maybe that correlates with today's climate changes and all the hurricanes and floods and fires and power outages that we see today. Maybe us getting out of balance with nature is a projection of our upheavals in Christianity, because obviously the Christian era is sort of leaving us people, the people identify as Christian, for instance, in the USA is predicted to be just 25% or something in the next 20 years. I forget the exact numbers that were projected, but many people identify as spiritual and not religious, and are suspicious of organized religions. In the new church era, which seems to be correlating with a huge climate change that's happening, there seems to be a rejection of organized religions and faith practices, and a preference for individual and maybe group spiritual practice and spiritual growth, and really what's going on inside. Swedenborg predicts this new era will not end. So does that mean we'll have a stable climate after this, or does it mean, perhaps in a more apocalyptic way, that the new church or the new way of spirituality won't end because the planet won't be here anymore? The climate changes will destroy us. I don't really believe that, but it's a possibility based on what I'm talking about. Okay, really quickly, because it's 2:42. From 1848 to the present, there is another practice, spiritualism, that I just wanted to touch on. It's a belief system and a religious movement that emerged here in the US in the mid-19th century, and it's still going, but it's sort of died out. But it's based on some of the mesmerism practices in the 1800s, Quakerism, and Swedenborgianism. Because Swedenborg claimed to communicate with angels and spirits and said that it's dangerous, but you can do it. And then there was also transcendentalism, which grew out of Swedenborgianism, which emphasized personal spiritual experience and the inherent divinity of humanity. And so a key belief in spiritualism is that you can communicate with spirits, that the soul survives, that in some cases people believe in reincarnation, not all of them. And spiritualism emphasizes the importance of morality, kindness, and spiritual growth. Do hold seances, and actually, I forget the name of the movie. It was a Netflix special, but Swedenborg featured in it a lot, and the people that called themselves Swedenborgians were having seances and contacting spirits. And really, but an important note about spiritualism is that there are different variations and beliefs amongst spiritualist organizations, and some of them consider it a religion and have spiritualist churches, which you can see here and there throughout the country, but others just view it as a philosophical or spiritual belief system. It sort of seems to be going full circle back to some of the more ancient practices of being able to welcome spirits into your life and feed them and take care of them and celebrate them. So that's really all I have to say, which was quite a bit.
Wow.
So now we got 15 minutes or more if you want to stay, for questions, answers, discussion, reactions, any of that.
I'll step up.
Yeah.
So much, so good. A lot of information, but I'm going to go back a little bit thinking about celebrating the death of a family. And we do that in that we have a tea once a year and celebrate. It started really with the death of my mother. But then we welcome anyone and celebrating the death of anyone and make it, try to make something that was one of their favorite things to make when we're cooking and having tea, like just to bring all those individual people to that moment in that day and that afternoon. And we started doing that probably about, I guess, 10 years ago. And we really like it. We really like it because sometimes you don't talk enough about the dead. They kind of get lost. And it's not in every family, but I would say in ours it did. And this helped bring them alive again. And I think that's important.
Did you develop that sort of organically, or did you have some practice that you had heard about that you wanted to use?
We did it. My mom was she loved coffee, but she loved tea too. And she had a beautiful tea set. And when we were cleaning up her house, it sort of evolved then. Oh, here's her tea set. Who's going to get her tea set? Well, nobody. We're all going to get the tea set, and we're going to celebrate every year. And it gets passed. This big basket and a couple bags of stuff gets passed because there's 6 of us, and it gets passed to one of the, sisters each year. And hopefully our children will carry it on too. And that's really how it evolved.
Yeah, that's incredible, and that's wonderful. So now I guess will you include your mother-in-law because she just died, or is it just for...
Yeah, well, you know what? I've been thinking about that through this whole thing, but I don't know. That's a whole big family too. We both come from really big families, They know that we do that with my mom, so I'll bring it up and see if it's something they would be interested in doing. Yeah.
It's beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to say, I think the movie you're thinking of is Things Heard and Seen.
What was it called?
Things Heard and Seen.
Yes, that's right. Things Heard and Seen.
And I wanted to say, as a Swedenborgian, I was super insulted when I saw that part because they raised us with Swedenborg's, caveats that are like, don't do seances, don't, because, and the reason, and this is important, right, that you might contact a harmful one.
Yeah.
And you wouldn't necessarily know, because they would try to trick you so that they could, you know, use you in ways to impact your world.
Right.
Like, that's why he just says to not do it. So to have a bunch of us portrayed in there as being like, how we conducting seances? Like, sure, we'll help you with your ghost problem. Like, it makes me frustrated that the only mass media image of a Swedenborgian right now is as the Ghostbusters. That's not who we are.
A couple of things. Wilson Van Dusen wrote The Presence of Spirits in Madness.
Mm-hmm.
He treated people that probably now would be called schizophrenic. He treated people that they were hearing the voices. He believed those were malicious spirits who got into, because many schizophrenics, like in I Never Promised You a Rose Garden, that girl's spirit started as helpful to her and progressed into tormenting her. And Wilson Van Dusen's approach to schizophrenia was, you have been tricked. These voices you're hearing that may have started out being your unseen friend, your imaginary playmate, tricked you into thinking they were working in your best interests. And now it's become manifest that they are not. Let's stop talking to them.
Wow.
And sometimes you need biochemical help to stop talking to them. You know, he didn't not believe in medication, but he felt that it was important for the person experiencing those communications to take them seriously as real communications from malicious spirits who could be turned aside, you know, who could be refused. And so that's something that I think is really interesting about that whole interface between this world and the next. When we were holding my mom's funeral service, Prescott Rogers gave that service, and he was talking about how much my mom loved my dad. And my dad wasn't always convinced that she did. And we both distinctly heard, I was clutching his hand and he was clutching mine. And we both heard her say, "Oh, Lou, you know I loved you," in her voice, clear as a bell. And he looked at me and I looked at him and he said, "Did you hear that?" And I said, "Yeah." And it was very cool, but it was unsolicited. And I think that's the point. You can have an experience of a loved one who has passed on that is a gift from God that you haven't sought. I saw my grandmother running around with a bunch of little kids through a field in heaven 3 days after she died in a sort of waking dream. Technicolor. It was just beautiful. And it was brief, and I did not seek it. But it was lovely to know that she is doing what she always did, which was teach little kids. I have not had a sense of my husband's presence, and he died a year ago. And it's been a little hard, but on the other hand, he's got to be busy right now. Because we had talked at great length throughout our marriage about what we would be doing in the spiritual world when we got there and what it would take to do that. And he has to learn how to sail a catamaran and he has to plant flax. But the night before he died, as I was saying goodbye to him, I had a sudden waking vision of him standing in the door of the house we had discussed, and we know what it looks like and how it works. And he was in the open door and he was saying, "I knew you were coming because the flax is blooming." And I'm a weaver, and he knew that once it blooms, it goes to seed and you have to start dealing with it if you ever want to spin it and weave it. And he also knew that he had no idea how to do any of that part. But we had talked about if he ended up being there for a long, long time before I get to join him, he could plant flax, he could get the apple trees going, he could learn how to sail the catamaran. all these things. But to have him greet me with, I knew you were coming because the flax is blooming. I really feel that's predictive. And I look forward to having him greet me that way, when I finally become regenerate enough to be worthy of his eternal affection.
Well, that's beautiful. Both of you, like what you're sharing, that's incredible. Really beautiful.
Well, I've always had, my brother totaled himself on his motorcycle one night when I was away at the dorm in college asleep. And I sat up in my bunk and said, "Stephen!" And I called home, and he had had a terrible motorcycle accident. He broke his femur, and it was a long recovery. But I knew something horrible had happened to my favorite brother.
Yeah.
Because it woke me up.
Yeah, I think that's to your point about spiritual contact of any kind. If it's not sought after, if it comes to you organically,
Unsought. Yeah.
That's just part of life. Humans throughout history have had those kind of experiences, some more than others. In the Celtic tradition, some people are said to have second sight. Is it the second sight? They can see into the future, or they have those sort of awarenesses more than others. And that's I think that's just a normal part of life. And we all can tell different stories that we've had or have heard of. I feel like, yes, there's definitely biblical and other prohibitions against seeking it. But all of those, like Mexican Day of the Dead, all of them sort of acknowledge it happens. Spirits come to you.
Yeah, they have in the New Age community now, they have the distinction between remote viewing, which is, I would think that's sort of what Swedenborg did more of, is like see places that are not local, and channeling, which is, letting a spirit possess you and then talk through your body. Like, there's even a distinction in the New Age community, and at least the people on the remote viewing side view the channeling people as like, that's not a good idea. Like,
No.
don't try to be in contact or like let someone speak through you. Retain control of your own consciousness. And if you're going to try to visualize a faraway place, like there was a story about Swedenborg that he knew when the fire of London was coming towards his house. And like
he was in England when this happened, and it was happening in Sweden.
Yeah, he was like suffering, and then finally he was like, "Oh, phew, it stopped before it got to my house." And that actually happened. Like, he could view all of that in another country.
So that's not really, I guess that's a spiritual viewing, isn't it? Because he was seeing something that wasn't happening right around him, but he was seeing something that was happening somewhere else in the world, not like.
Or he'd been informed about it.
Oh, right. He was in touch. Yeah. Sorry, I
was informed about it.
But he was a revelator. They're special. So.
Yeah. Well, we're probably out of time.
Okay.
It's been wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Namaste.
Good to see you, Janice.
Good to see you too. Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Roslyn.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Roslyn, I'm going to leave. Bye.
Yep.
What is Halloween? A warning, hidden and unseen. Civilization sleep beneath the tide side. Real secrets still locked inside. Children don playful disguises, and the old question again arises. Maybe someday we'll know what it means. What is Halloween?